One of the most misunderstood variables among snare drums is the effect that the lug count has on the behavior of the drum and what the tuning range is, basically everything about it. Some older drums, 6 lugs, all the way up to 10, some even have 12, and we're going to talk about what that means today. When snare drums were first being used with drum sets early in the century, none of this stuff was standardized, and over the course of the century, 10 lugs per side on a snare drum has kind of become the standard, and 8 lug, I would say, is also standard, but tends to go toward a more budget-minded drum. If you were getting like a Gretsch Catalina kit or a Tama Rockstar, that kind of thing, the snares usually come with 8 lugs to a side, which is more than enough to get a lot of sounds out of a snare drum. Some older drums, like this Ludwig Pioneer, have only 6 to a side. We also have a round badge Gretsch here that is similarly constructed from the same era. These were student model drums at that time, and so the choice of less lugs was basically a cost-saving measure. But they also sound great and are really an interesting sound to add to your arsenal for not a lot of money because they're very, very common. There was a question just in this last week on the channel about tuning a 6-lug drum and whether the scheme needs to be different or if you need to think about it differently. And what this all boils down to is the concept of nodes of pressure on the drum head. When you imagine a circular drum head by itself with no lugs, it's one smooth edge around the entire head. When you bring the hoop onto it, we still are at one smooth edge around the head. Then you start putting screws into it and everything changes because there is not equal pressure at the lug and at the point between 2 of the lugs. There's a release of pressure at this center point just a little bit. The more lugs you have, the less release there can be between them because there's less distance for the pressure to be alleviated by the pushback from the hoop of the drum head. So what that means is this drum is going to have a more dramatic pitch shift between the lugs than this one, and even more so than this one. What this means is that to tune these 3 drums to the same pitch, the lugs on this drum have to be tighter to compensate for the loss of pressure in between the lugs. If you've ever seen somebody tune a 20-inch bass drum that has 10 lugs to a side, like maybe a Yamaha or something like that, and they want a low sound, pretty quickly you're seeing wrinkles in the head, you're seeing lugs falling out, you're hearing rattles and things like that because it's too many nodes of pressure to go that low on a head that small. Conversely, one of my favorite bass drums is owned by a studio nearby, and it's an old Gretsch bass drum that's 22 inches in diameter, but it only has 8 lugs on it. And because of that, you can tension it up a little bit tighter than if it had 10 lugs, but the fundamental pitch of the drum stays lower because there is some relief and tension between where those lugs are located. Another way to think about this is if I tune this drum to a given pitch and I want this drum to be tuned to the same pitch, you can imagine it as a quarter turn less of these lugs, and then in this drum, maybe a quarter turn less again to end up at the same amount of pressure and resulting in the same pitch. The main thing that happens when you take some of the lugs out of the equation and move from a 10 lug to a 6 or an 8 is a smaller tuning range before you're going to choke out the drum. This is more apparent on the snare side head in my experience than on the batter head. But there's a point where you'll be cranking this head tighter and tighter and tighter, and it will basically just give out and become like a tabletop. Whereas with an 8 lug or a 10 lug, you can go higher because the differential between the lugs is not as dramatic, the pitch differential, because of that distance in between. You're getting a more even tuning across all of the keys. And with a 6 lug drum, the whole drum will never be as even as a 10 lug drum because of the hoops. If you switch to a die cast hoop like our Gretsch drum has, you will get more pressure in those distances between the lugs and a more even sound, but then you're also contending with the weight of that hoop working against you to possibly choke the drum as well, especially if you're dealing with a vintage drum that's made of lighter weight wood like mahogany or jasper. In terms of sound, I had drums like this described to me as having a more open sound and a more lively sound and a little bit wilder of a sound than a 10 lug drum. The first time I played one, that was exactly what it felt like to me. Overall, it behaved like a drum that was tensioned tightly because it was tensioned tightly, but the sound of the drum was darker and raspier, and the overtones were messier because there is this room between the lugs for the pitch to kind of come away from what you tuned the drum to. And it results also in a drum that's a little bit quieter, which is nice sometimes, and also a drum that, in a strange way, will cut through the mix because there's a kind of distortion to the main tone that happens when you have those sort of crunchy overtones banging into each other on the head. Even though it's in tune and it's ringing and it sounds really great, it's almost like it's got a little bit of a stomp box on it, like a little bit of overdrive or something that makes it run through. I think of the Black Keys and those sorts of drum sounds where they are literally putting distortion on them, but they also use vintage drums sometimes to get those sounds. People also use acrylites for that, but that is a little bit more pristine of a sound in terms of the instrument than something like this. There is a certain degree of irony in making a student model drum that is actually more difficult to tune than if it had more lugs, because if you don't have a lot of experience tuning, a 6-lug drum can be really, really fussy. Not as fussy as a 5-lug Gretsch drum. That's where they start to get really ridiculous. But a 6-lug drum is trickier to tune, and you also have to be willing to settle for a certain amount of wobbliness in the overtones that's inherent in not having that many nodes of pressure. But on the flip side, that is what contributes to the unique sound of this sort of instrument and makes it really fun, especially for studio situations when you want something that has an undeniably kind of janky character that, a really nice modern drum, you'll have to fight to get it to do that, and this will just do it right out of the box. We tend to associate 6-lug snare drums with vintage instruments, which also means that you may run into not the best bearing edges or unusual or rounded bearing edges, which could further complicate this whole tuning scenario. It makes it a little bit different, and there is a learning curve to dealing with something that is so different than if you're coming from something like a Superphonic or another kind of modern drum. But it's definitely worth the time, and if you jump on Craigslist or eBay, these sorts of drums are actually very inexpensive and can be a lot of fun and just add kind of a special dimension to your overall sound. I took a moment earlier to tune these drums to the same pitch, and I just want to give a quick demonstration of sort of the arc of difference in sound, which is basically coming from quite articulate to not as articulate, a little more messy, a little more dirty sounding. We'll start with the 10 lug. And just to prove that these are all the same pitch,